The people we ignore the fastest are sometimes the ones holding our future in their hands. Rain slid slowly down the glass walls of Orion Tower, while the city of Manhattan glowed cold and silver beneath the storm. On the 61st floor, inside one of the most exclusive private dining rooms in New York, Adrian Cole watched $600 million disappear in real time. The contract sitting in front of him had taken almost a year to negotiate. 11 months of flights between New York and Beijing. Endless board meetings. Endless strategy calls. Endless promises to shareholders. And now it was collapsing because of one sentence nobody in the room seemed to fully understand. The elderly chairman of Dragon Gate Holdings slowly pushed the leather folder away from himself and stood up from the table without touching his tea. The movement was calm, controlled. Somehow that made it worse. Around the room, expensive watches glimmered beneath soft amber lighting while nervous executives exchanged silent looks. Crystal glasses sat untouched beside plates that had gone cold nearly 30 minutes earlier. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Translate what he said," he ordered sharply. The young translator sitting beside him adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers. "Mr. Liang says, the partnership no longer benefits their long-term interests." Adrian stared at him. Something felt wrong immediately. He had spent 20 years building Cole Dynamics from a struggling software startup into one of the most powerful technology firms on the East Coast. He knew negotiations. He knew fear. And right now, fear was sitting at that table wearing a $1,000 suit and pretending not to sweat. Across the windows, thunder rolled over Manhattan. Adrian slowly loosened the knot of his dark tie. If this deal failed tonight, Asian markets would open in less than 9 hours. Investors would panic by morning. Headlines would destroy his company before lunch. "Mr. Liang," Adrian said carefully, forcing calm into his voice, "if there's been a misunderstanding, I assure you we can resolve it." The older businessman finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable. Then he replied in Mandarin. Fast. Cold. Precise. The translator froze again. Silence spread across the room like smoke. Adrian's patience snapped. "Translate it." But before the terrified young man could answer, another voice quietly entered the room. He said trust is impossible when a man insults the memory of his own father. Every head turned instantly. Standing near the wall beside the tea service cart was a waitress holding a silver tray against her black uniform. Blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Calm blue eyes. Perfect posture. Invisible only seconds ago. Adrian frowned in disbelief. "What did you just say?" The waitress stepped forward carefully, setting the tray down with steady hands. "Your translator misunderstood the cultural meaning," she said softly. Then she turned toward Mr. Liang and spoke flawless Mandarin. The room went completely still. Not conversational Mandarin. Not memorized tourist phrases. This was elegant. Refined. Native-level fluency spoken with the smooth rhythm of someone who had lived inside the language for years. Even Mr. Liang looked surprised. The waitress continued speaking calmly, while the older businessman listened without interrupting once. Adrian watched the tension slowly leave the man's face. Finally, after several long seconds, Mr. Liang sat back down in his chair. One of the executives quietly exhaled in relief. The waitress turned back toward Adrian. "Earlier during dinner," she explained gently, "when you joked that old traditions slow modern business, the phrase you used sounded disrespectful toward ancestral honor." Adrian suddenly remembered the joke. A careless comment made while pouring wine. Small. Thoughtless. Forgettable. Except apparently it wasn't. Mr. Liang spoke again, this time slower. The waitress translated immediately. "In my country," the older man said quietly, "how a man speaks about his father tells us how he will treat his partners." Silence filled the room once more. But this silence felt different. Softer somehow. Adrian stared at the waitress standing beneath the warm golden lights while rain tapped quietly against the glass behind her. "What's your name?" he asked at last. She met his eyes calmly. "Eleanor Hayes." And for reasons Adrian could not explain yet, that name stayed in his mind long after the meeting resumed. By the time Adrian Cole stepped out of Orion Tower, the rain had turned Manhattan into a river of silver reflections and blurred headlights. His driver opened the back door of the black Maybach immediately, but Adrian did not move. Across the street, Through the wet glow of neon signs and passing taxis, he spotted Eleanor Hayes leaving the building alone with a dark coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. No limousine. No assistant. No umbrella carried over her head like the executives upstairs. Just a quiet waitress disappearing into the storm with a canvas tote bag hanging from one shoulder. Adrian glanced at his watch. Almost midnight. "Wait here," he told the driver calmly. The man looked surprised. "Sir." But Adrian was already crossing the street through cold rain and impatient traffic. Eleanor walked quickly, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles along the sidewalk, while the city rushed around her in exhausted silence. She passed luxury hotels without looking up, past glowing jewelry stores guarded behind polished glass, past restaurants where couples laughed over $100 dinners. Yet she seemed completely untouched by any of it. Adrian slowed his pace several yards behind her. Something about this felt irrational. He had billion-dollar negotiations waiting tomorrow morning, board members expecting updates, investors already demanding reassurance after tonight's near disaster. And still, he found himself following a waitress through rainy Manhattan because her voice had unsettled him in a way numbers never could. Eleanor finally descended the subway stairs near Lexington Avenue. Adrian stopped briefly at the entrance, staring down into the fluorescent underground station below. He could have turned around then. Any reasonable man would have. Instead, he adjusted his coat and followed her downstairs. The station smelled faintly of rainwater and metal. A tired saxophone player stood near the far tunnel wall performing soft jazz while commuters hurried past with lowered heads and coffee cups clutched between cold hands. Eleanor sat quietly on a bench near the tracks, removing a small notebook from her bag. Adrian stayed partially hidden behind a concrete pillar several feet away. Then he saw something unexpected. A young Asian boy, maybe 9 years old, approached Eleanor nervously holding a workbook against his chest. Eleanor's face softened immediately. She smiled warmly and patted the empty seat beside her. The boy sat down, and within seconds Eleanor was helping him practice Mandarin pronunciation from the workbook. Adrian listened carefully as she corrected tones with patient gentleness. "Not too sharp," she told him softly. "The word changes meaning if you rush it." The boy repeated the phrase again. Eleanor laughed quietly. "Better. Much better." Adrian stared at her in disbelief. This was not rehearsed fluency. Not something learned from textbooks or business seminars. This was intimacy with language, culture, emotion. The train thundered briefly through the station before disappearing again into darkness. Eleanor tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear while helping the boy write Chinese characters carefully across the page. The child looked up at her with complete trust. "My teacher says I sound American," he admitted sadly. Eleanor smiled. "There is nothing wrong with sounding like yourself." Adrian felt something strange settle in his chest at those words. The boy's mother soon arrived, apologizing for being late after a hospital shift. Eleanor stood immediately and handed back the workbook. The woman thanked her repeatedly in Mandarin. Eleanor answered politely before gathering her own worn bag again. And that was when Adrian noticed it. The edge of a medical bill partially visible inside the tote bag. "Past due. Final notice stamped in red across the top." Eleanor quickly slid the paper deeper into the bag before anyone else could see it. But Adrian had already seen enough. The train lights approached in the tunnel, casting silver reflections across the station walls. Eleanor stepped toward the platform without noticing the billionaire watching silently from the shadows. And for the first time in many years, Adrian Cole realized money could buy influence, buildings, companies, and entire markets. But it could not explain dignity like hers. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The restaurant buzzed softly around them with expensive laughter, clinking glasses and piano music drifting beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet the silence between Adrian Cole and Eleanor Hayes somehow felt louder than all of it. Eleanor held the silver tray carefully against her black uniform while Adrian studied her expression. Most people looked away from him eventually. Employees, investors, politicians, even competitors. They all lowered their eyes sooner or later. Eleanor did not. "I did not mean to offend you," Adrian said finally. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "You did not offend me, Mr. Cole." "Then why did that sound like criticism?" A faint smile touched her lips for less than a second. Because it was. The honesty caught him off guard. Nearby, a waiter nearly dropped a wine opener after overhearing the exchange. Adrian noticed the panic immediately spreading across the manager's face. Everyone expected consequences when people spoke to him that way. Eleanor simply stood there calmly beneath warm golden lights as though power meant very little to her. 5 minutes, Adrian repeated quietly. That is all I am asking. Eleanor glanced toward her tables again. One elderly couple waited patiently near the windows while another server carried fresh bread through the dining room. Responsibility flashed across her face before she looked back at him. 3 minutes, she said at last. Adrian nodded once. Eleanor led him toward a quieter hallway near the restaurant's private wine cellar, where the noise of the dining room faded into soft echoes. Dim amber lighting reflected across dark wooden walls lined with imported bottles from Italy and France. The scent of cedar and polished oak filled the air. Eleanor placed the tray down on a side counter before folding her hands calmly in front of her. What exactly do you want to know? Adrian studied her carefully. Up close, she looked even younger than he remembered from the night before. Tired too. There were faint shadows beneath her blue eyes that expensive makeup could not completely hide. Where did you really learn Mandarin? He asked directly. Eleanor's expression barely changed. I told Mr. Liang already. My father worked in Beijing. Children do not develop that level of fluency from casual exposure. Some do. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his charcoal coat. You speak like someone trained in diplomacy. For the first time, Eleanor looked slightly surprised. Small. Almost invisible. But he noticed it. That is an unusual observation for a technology executive, she replied quietly. I notice patterns, Adrian answered. It is how I built my company. Eleanor looked away briefly toward the wine shelves. And does analyzing strangers usually help you relax after work? The question carried no mockery, only quiet curiosity. Adrian realized suddenly how strange this entire situation would appear to anyone else. One of the most powerful men on Wall Street standing inside a restaurant hallway questioning a waitress about language patterns. Yet somehow Eleanor still seemed calmer than he was. You saved my company last night, he said after a pause. I prefer not watching people destroy themselves over misunderstandings. That was not just misunderstanding, Adrian replied. You understood cultural nuance my entire international division missed. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly together before relaxing again. Language is not vocabulary, she said softly. It is emotion, history, family, respect. Adrian stared at her. Nobody in his corporate world spoke like that anymore. Meetings reduced entire countries into charts and percentages. Human emotion became market strategy. Yet standing here beside dusty wine shelves and soft amber lights, a waitress was speaking about language with more intelligence than most diplomats he had hired. You are overqualified for this place, he said quietly before he could stop himself. Eleanor's eyes lifted back toward him immediately. This time there was no softness in them. And you are overqualified to judge people you do not know. The words landed harder than Adrian expected. Not because they were rude, because they were true. Somewhere beyond the hallway, thunder rolled softly over Manhattan, while rain continued tapping against the restaurant windows. Eleanor picked up the silver tray again, preparing to leave. Then she paused. 3 minutes are over, Mr. Cole. Adrian watched her carefully. You still have not answered my question. Eleanor met his eyes one last time beneath the warm dim lights. Maybe, she said quietly, because some parts of people are expensive to explain. The expression on Eleanor's face disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. 1 second of vulnerability, then gone. She slipped her phone into the pocket of her coat and lifted her chin slightly. I should go, she said quietly. Adrian watched her carefully. Which hospital? Eleanor's eyes narrowed immediately. Why? Because you look worried. People can be worried without needing help. Adrian almost answered automatically the way he usually did in business meetings. Efficiently. Logically. But something stopped him. Eleanor did not respond well to pressure. Every time he pushed too hard, she stepped further away emotionally. So instead he softened his voice. Fair enough. That seemed to surprise her more than the question itself. Outside the restaurant windows, rain continued washing silver streaks across Manhattan, while the city moved endlessly below. Taxi lights reflected against wet pavement. Steam rose from subway grates. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly through the night before fading away again. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her canvas bag against her shoulder. Adrian noticed how worn the fabric looked up close, fraying near the corners, repaired stitching along one side. Strange details for a woman who spoke like a diplomat and carried herself with quiet elegance. "You really do notice everything, do you not?" Eleanor asked softly. Adrian looked at her. "Usually." A faint smile touched her lips again. "Tired this time? That sounds exhausting." He almost laughed at the honesty of it. "Almost." Instead he asked, "Does your sister know you work double shifts?" Eleanor looked away toward the windows. "She thinks I only work evenings." "And the hospital bills?" Silence answered him first. Then Eleanor spoke quietly. "My father died 3 years ago." The words landed gently, but Adrian still felt the weight behind them. "After that," she continued, "everything became about survival very quickly." Adrian said nothing. He had attended funerals his entire life. Business partners, competitors, politicians. Yet death in his world always came cushioned by money. Lawyers appeared. Trust funds activated. Problems softened beneath wealth. But standing here beneath fading restaurant lights, he suddenly realized grief felt very different when bills kept arriving afterward. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around herself. "My sister has a heart condition," she admitted carefully. "Nothing life-threatening right now. Just expensive." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. He remembered the overdue medical notice inside her bag at the subway station. Suddenly everything connected together. The double shifts. The exhaustion hidden beneath her calm expression. The online tutoring. The refusal to accept pity. "And Colombia?" he asked quietly before thinking. Eleanor froze. Completely still. Adrian immediately realized he had said too much. Her eyes lifted slowly toward his face. "How do you know about Colombia?" The warmth between them vanished instantly. Adrian held her gaze. "I had someone look into your background." Silence. Heavy this time. Eleanor stared at him as if reassessing everything she thought she understood about him. Not fear. Disappointment. Again. Somehow that felt worse. "Of course you did," she said softly. Adrian exhaled slowly. "I needed to understand who saved my company." "No," Eleanor replied quietly. "You needed to understand something you could not control." The words hit with uncomfortable precision. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor stepped back, already shaking her head gently. "That is the difference between us, Mr. Cole." "And what difference is that?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment beneath the soft amber lights while distant thunder rolled outside over Manhattan. "When life took everything from me," she said quietly, "I learned to survive uncertainty." Her blue eyes held his steadily now. "You built your entire life trying to eliminate it." Adrian felt strangely exposed standing there. Like she had read something inside him nobody else noticed anymore. Eleanor reached for the restaurant door handle leading toward the rainy street outside. Then she paused one final time without turning around. "For what it is worth," she said softly, "I never wanted you to know who I was before this." The door opened. Cold rain-scented air drifted briefly inside. And before Adrian could answer, Eleanor Hayes disappeared into the Manhattan night once again. Adrian remained near the hallway long after he should have left. The hospital lights cast pale reflections across the polished floor, while nurses moved quietly between rooms carrying charts and paper coffee cups. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a machine beeped steadily in slow rhythm. Yet all Adrian could focus on was Eleanor sitting beside her younger sister with exhausted eyes and a smile she clearly forced only for the girl in that bed. He watched Eleanor peel an orange carefully and separate each slice before handing it over one at a time. Small movements. Gentle movements. The kind people made when they had spent years taking care of someone they loved. Her sister laughed softly at something again, and Eleanor touched the girl's forehead for just a second like she needed reassurance more than words. Adrian looked away instinctively. Something about the intimacy of that moment felt private in a way boardrooms never were. He had seen billion-dollar mergers handled with less emotional precision than the way Eleanor adjusted a hospital blanket. After several minutes, he quietly stepped back toward the elevators. But before he could leave, a voice stopped him. "Mr. Cole." Adrian turned. Eleanor stood several feet behind him now, her expression unreadable beneath the harsh white hospital lighting. She looked tired. More tired than she allowed herself to appear inside the restaurant. Loose strands of blonde hair framed her face while faint shadows rested beneath her blue eyes. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his coat slowly. "I did not mean to intrude." Eleanor crossed her arms lightly. "You followed me from the restaurant to the hospital. That sounds worse when you say it out loud." To his surprise, Eleanor almost smiled at that. Almost. But it disappeared quickly. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. Adrian considered giving a polished answer, something careful and professional. Instead he told the truth. "Because I could not stop thinking about you." Silence. Not romantic. Not uncomfortable. Just honest enough to catch both of them off guard. Eleanor studied him carefully as if trying to decide whether powerful men ever said anything without strategy behind it. "That sounds dangerous," she replied quietly. Adrian looked toward the hospital room behind her where her younger sister now slept peacefully beneath dimmed lights. "Your sister seems strong." Eleanor's expression softened immediately. "Her name is Lucy." "How old is she?" 17. Adrian nodded slowly. "And the heart condition?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "She needs surgery eventually. The doctors are monitoring things for now." Eventually usually means expensive. Eleanor let out a tired breath through her nose. "You really do not know how to stop analyzing people, do you?" "No," Adrian admitted calmly. "Probably not." For a moment they simply stood there listening to distant hospital sounds and rain tapping softly against the windows outside. Then Eleanor looked at him more seriously. "You should go home, Mr. Cole." "Adrian." "What?" "You keep calling me Mr. Cole." Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "That is because men like you usually prefer distance." Adrian stared at her. "And men like me?" Eleanor gave a faint shrug. "Powerful. Controlled. Surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear." Adrian almost responded defensively. Almost. But then he realized she was not being cruel. She was simply observant. The same way he observed markets and negotiations, Eleanor observed people. "You think you understand me already?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. "No," she answered softly. "I think you understand yourself less than everyone around you believes." The words settled heavily between them. Adrian had spent years being called brilliant, strategic, ruthless, visionary. Nobody had ever accused him of not understanding himself. Yet standing in a quiet hospital hallway at nearly 1 in the morning, he suddenly felt exposed in a way financial risk had never accomplished. Eleanor glanced back toward Lucy's room before speaking again. "My sister likes jasmine tea," she said unexpectedly. Adrian frowned slightly. "What?" "Last night after the meeting," Eleanor explained quietly, "you noticed Mr. Leong never touched his tea once he became offended." Adrian nodded slowly. "Most people only watch important people," Eleanor said. "But if you really want to understand someone, watch what they stop touching." Adrian stared at her in silence. Then Eleanor stepped backward toward her sister's room again. "Good night, Adrian." And for the first time since meeting her, hearing his first name in her voice felt more significant than closing a $600 million deal. Morning light spilled softly through the hospital windows when Adrian Cole stepped into the cardiology wing carrying 2 warm paper cups in his hands. Nurses moved quietly through the corridor, while distant conversations blended with the steady rhythm of machines and rolling carts. Everything smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Adrian noticed immediately how different hospitals felt in daylight. Less dramatic. More honest somehow. People looked tired here without trying to hide it. He spotted Eleanor near the vending machines at the far end of the hallway, still wearing the same dark sweater from the night before. Her blonde hair was tied loosely now, and she looked exhausted enough that even her calm posture could not fully disguise it. She blinked in surprise the moment she saw him walking toward her. "You came back," she said quietly. Adrian held up one of the cups slightly. You stopped touching jasmine tea after Mr. Liang became offended. Eleanor looked genuinely caught off guard for the first time since meeting him. Adrian handed her the warm cup carefully. So I guess coffee might be a better choice this morning. She stared at the cup for several silent seconds before taking it slowly. Most people hear words, she said softly. You remember behavior. Adrian leaned lightly against the wall beside her. You taught me to. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the coffee lid. And for the first time, Adrian noticed her defenses soften without disappearing completely. You should not listen to waitresses too carefully, she murmured. It changes people. Adrian almost smiled. That already happened. Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment while sunlight reflected pale gold across the polished hospital floor. Somewhere nearby, a nurse laughed softly at something a patient said. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, like she was trying to absorb warmth from it. Lucy finally fell asleep around for this morning, she explained quietly. She hates hospitals. Most people do. Eleanor glanced sideways at him. You seem strangely comfortable in one. Adrian looked through the nearby window overlooking Manhattan traffic below. My father spent almost a year inside hospitals before he died. Eleanor's expression shifted immediately. Softer now. Less guarded. I am sorry. Adrian nodded once. Everyone said the same thing after the funeral. He paused briefly. But nobody asked if I was angry. Eleanor watched him carefully. Adrian realized suddenly, he had not spoken honestly about his father to anyone in months. Maybe longer. Were you? She asked gently. Adrian exhaled slowly. Very. The word hung quietly between them. He built an empire, Adrian continued. But he spent so much time protecting it that he forgot how to be a father inside it. Eleanor listened without interrupting. No fake sympathy. No rehearsed comforting expressions. Just attention. Real attention. Adrian found that strangely rare. And after he died, he said quietly, everyone expected me to become him. Eleanor looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. Did you? Adrian thought about the question carefully. I became successful, he answered at last. That is not always the same thing. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Then she surprised him. My father used to say language matters because people hide truth inside ordinary sentences. Adrian turned toward her fully now. What does that mean? Eleanor gave a faint tired smile. You did not say you became happy. The words landed softly, but Adrian felt them anyway. Outside the hospital windows, Manhattan moved endlessly beneath bright morning sunlight while ambulances and taxis flowed through crowded streets below. Yet standing beside Eleanor Hayes in a quiet hospital hallway, Adrian suddenly felt more exposed than he ever had inside a boardroom. A doctor emerged from Lucy's room then carrying a tablet. Eleanor straightened immediately, anxiety flashing across her face before she could hide it. Miss Hayes? The doctor asked gently. Eleanor nodded quickly. Is everything all right? The doctor offered a reassuring smile. Your sister's latest results came back this morning. Eleanor stopped breathing for half a second. Adrian noticed immediately. The doctor glanced down at the chart again before continuing. There may be another treatment option available now. For the rest of the morning, Eleanor could not stop thinking about the way Adrian had looked at her after making the offer. There had been no arrogance in his voice. No pressure. No subtle expectation hidden beneath polished words. That alone made it difficult to trust. People with power almost always wanted something in return eventually. Eleanor learned that lesson long before she learned how to survive Manhattan alone. By early afternoon, Lucy was finally asleep again while soft sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds in pale golden lines across the room. Eleanor sat quietly beside the bed grading Mandarin worksheets from her online tutoring students when her phone buzzed softly against the chair arm. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. Miss Hayes. The voice sounded professional. Calm. This is Daniel Brooks from Cole Dynamics. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Of course. Mr. Cole asked me to send over preliminary information regarding the cultural strategy consultant position. Eleanor stared at the sleeping figure of her younger sister. I did not agree to anything. Understood, Daniel replied politely. Mr. Cole specifically requested there be no pressure attached to the offer. That sentence unsettled her more than pressure would have. What exactly does the position involve? She asked carefully. International negotiation support, cultural communication analysis, language consultation during overseas partnerships. Eleanor looked down at the worksheets in her lap filled with handwritten Mandarin characters from children trying to hold on to languages their parents feared America might erase. Two completely different worlds. And the salary? She asked quietly. Daniel paused for half a second. The starting compensation would be $200,000 annually plus medical coverage. Eleanor nearly dropped the phone. $200,000. Her entire body went still. That amount could cover Lucy's treatment, the apartment rent, outstanding hospital debt, maybe even allow her to breathe again for the first time in years. Yet instead of relief, suspicion tightened slowly inside her chest. Why? She asked softly. Silence lingered briefly on the line. Then Daniel answered honestly. Because Mr. Cole believes you are significantly underutilized. Eleanor almost laughed at the corporate phrasing. Almost. That sounds like something written by human resources. To her surprise, Daniel chuckled quietly. Actually, those were his exact words. Eleanor stared toward the hospital window where Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath bright afternoon light. Somewhere inside that skyline sat Adrian Cole's world of private jets, negotiations, and glass towers. A world she had spent years trying to avoid after watching ambition destroy her father piece by piece overseas. I need time, she said at last. Of course. Daniel's voice softened slightly. For what it is worth, Miss Hayes, Mr. Cole rarely changes his schedule for anyone. Eleanor frowned faintly. What does that mean? He canceled 3 investor meetings this morning after leaving the hospital. Her grip tightened around the phone. Why would he do that? Daniel hesitated carefully. I think he is trying to understand something. The call ended a few moments later, but Eleanor remained motionless beside Lucy's bed long afterward. $200,000. The number echoed inside her mind with terrifying weight. Lucy shifted slightly beneath the blankets before opening her eyes slowly. You look stressed, she murmured sleepily. Eleanor forced a small smile. I am thinking. Lucy studied her older sister carefully. About the billionaire? Eleanor blinked in surprise. What? Lucy smiled weakly. You only stare at windows like that when someone complicated enters your life. Eleanor looked away immediately. He offered me a job. Lucy's eyes widened. A real job? Apparently. Well, Lucy whispered. That sounds better than carrying soup trays for rich people who mispronounce wine names. Eleanor laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound faded quickly though. People like Adrian Cole do not offer things without reasons. Lucy watched her quietly for several seconds. Then she asked the question Eleanor had been avoiding all afternoon. And what if his reason is simply that he sees you? The room fell silent after that. Outside the hospital window, sunlight reflected against distant skyscrapers, while New York moved endlessly forward below. But for the first time in years, Eleanor Hayes felt like her carefully controlled life had begun shifting beneath her feet. And the most frightening part was not the offer itself. It was realizing a small part of her wanted to say yes. For several seconds after Adrian spoke, neither of them moved. Rain drifted softly across the glass walls behind him while Manhattan blurred beneath gray afternoon clouds. Eleanor sat perfectly still in the leather chair across from his desk, her fingers resting lightly against the strap of her bag, as though she suddenly needed something steady to hold on to. Maybe you are the one changing me. The sentence lingered in the room with dangerous quietness. Not because it sounded romantic, because it sounded true. Eleanor looked away first, toward the skyline outside the windows where helicopters moved slowly between towers wrapped in mist and rain. People like you are not supposed to say things like that, she murmured softly. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. People like me are usually surrounded by people pretending to agree with us. Eleanor almost smiled again, but this time sadness touched the edges of it. And now? Adrian watched her carefully. Now I am sitting across from someone who corrects me when I am wrong. Silence settled gently between them while distant thunder rolled over the city. Then a knock interrupted the moment. Adrian's assistant stepped carefully into the office carrying a tablet. Mr. Cole, the Singapore investors are waiting in conference room 3. Adrian barely glanced up. Reschedule. The assistant hesitated visibly. Sir, this is the third meeting moved this week. Adrian's expression remained calm. Then move it again. Eleanor stared at him after the assistant quietly left the office. You should not keep rearranging billion-dollar meetings because of me. Adrian folded his hands together loosely. Why does everyone assume business matters more than people? Eleanor gave him a long look. Because your entire industry was built on that idea. Adrian could not argue with her. That was the unsettling part. Since meeting Eleanor, he kept hearing truths nobody around him normally dared to say aloud. The office grew quiet again except for the soft tapping of rain against the windows. Finally, Eleanor reached into her bag and removed the employment contract Daniel had emailed earlier that morning. The pages looked strangely formal resting in her hands. $200,000. Full medical coverage. International travel. A completely different life sitting inside black printed text. I have one condition, she said quietly. Adrian's attention sharpened immediately. Name it. Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. If I work here, I do not want special treatment because of Lucy. Adrian nodded once without hesitation. Done. And I am not interested in becoming your personal project. Something flickered across Adrian's face then. Not offense. Something closer to understanding. Eleanor, he said quietly, you are not a project. She studied him carefully, searching again for manipulation hidden beneath polished confidence. But Adrian's expression remained steady. Honest. Uncomfortably honest. Then why does this feel personal to you? She asked softly. Adrian stood slowly and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. For a few seconds he said nothing while rain traced silver lines across the glass. Because after my father died, he admitted quietly, I stopped noticing people. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Adrian kept his eyes on the city below. Everyone around me became useful or irrelevant, efficient or inefficient, profitable or expensive. He paused briefly. Then you walked into a negotiation room carrying tea, and somehow reminded me there are human beings behind conversations. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the unsigned contract in her hands. Outside, the city moved endlessly through rain and traffic and noise. Yet inside the office, the silence between them no longer felt cold. You know what the strange part is? Adrian asked quietly without turning around. Eleanor looked up. What? A faint smile touched his face. You still seem more comfortable in a hospital hallway than in this office. This time Eleanor actually laughed softly. Real laughter. Warm enough to change the entire atmosphere of the room. Adrian turned toward her then, and for one brief second neither of them looked away. Not billionaire and waitress. Not executive and consultant. Just two exhausted people standing on opposite sides of very different lives somehow meeting in the middle. Eleanor finally picked up the pen resting beside the contract. Her fingers hovered above the signature line for several long seconds before she spoke again. If this turns into a mistake, she warned quietly, I reserve the right to say I told you so. Adrian's eyes softened with the smallest trace of amusement. Honestly, he said gently, I am starting to suspect you usually do. Winter arrived quietly in Manhattan that year. Cold wind curled between skyscrapers while silver snow drifted across crowded sidewalks and glowing storefront windows downtown. Inside Mount Sinai Hospital, warm yellow lights reflected softly against polished floors as nurses moved through the cardiology wing carrying charts and quiet conversations. Eleanor Hayes stood near the window of Lucy's recovery room holding 2 paper cups of coffee, while snow fell gently beyond the glass outside. 6 months earlier she had been carrying silver trays through a luxury restaurant trying to survive another exhausting double shift. Now she wore a charcoal wool coat over professional office clothes, and for the first time in years, exhaustion no longer lived permanently behind her eyes. The surgery had lasted almost 5 hours that morning. 5 hours of waiting beneath fluorescent hospital lights while every terrible possibility moved silently through Eleanor's mind. Adrian stayed the entire time. He canceled meetings again without hesitation, ignored investor calls, sat beside her in silence when words stopped helping. Around noon, Lucy's surgeon finally stepped into the waiting room with tired eyes and a small relieved smile. The procedure went very well. Eleanor nearly cried from the force of relief, hitting her chest all at once. But instead of collapsing, she simply lowered her face into her hands for one quiet second while Adrian placed a steady hand gently against her shoulder. No speeches. No dramatic promises. Just presence. Real and steady. Hours later, Lucy finally woke up smiling weakly beneath warm hospital blankets, while snow continued falling over the city outside. "You both look terrible," she whispered hoarsely. Eleanor laughed softly through exhausted tears while Adrian shook his head beside the bed. "That is the first rude thing you have said after surgery," he replied calmly. Lucy smiled faintly. "Pain medication makes me honest." The room filled with quiet laughter then. Small. Human. The kind Eleanor once thought disappeared when life became difficult enough. Later that evening, Lucy finally drifted back asleep while Adrian and Eleanor stepped into the hallway carrying untouched coffee cups. Snowlight reflected pale silver through the windows overlooking Manhattan below. The hospital had grown quieter now. Slower. Eleanor leaned lightly against the wall beside him, staring out at the city through tired blue eyes. "She is going to be okay," she whispered softly, almost like she still could not fully believe it herself. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled gently between them while distant hospital sounds echoed softly down the corridor. Then Eleanor looked at him carefully. "You know something strange?" Adrian glanced toward her. "What?" A small smile touched her lips. "You still do not drink the expensive whiskey in your apartment, do you?" Adrian looked surprised before quietly laughing under his breath. "No." Eleanor nodded slowly toward the untouched coffee in his hand. "But now you drink coffee when you are worried about people." Adrian stared at the cup briefly before looking back at her. "You notice everything." Eleanor's expression softened. "Only important things." The words lingered quietly between them while snow continued drifting across the city skyline outside. Adrian stepped slightly closer then, his voice calm beneath the warm hospital lights. "That night at the restaurant," he said softly, "I thought you saved a business deal." Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "And now?" Adrian looked toward Lucy's room where soft light glowed through the partially open doorway. Then back at Eleanor again. "Now I think you reminded me how to be human inside my own life." For a moment neither of them moved. The city below continued rushing endlessly through snow and headlights and noise, but the silence between them no longer felt lonely. Eleanor finally reached for the untouched coffee in Adrian's hand, and took a small sip herself before smiling faintly. "Careful," she murmured softly. "That is usually how change begins." Adrian watched her quietly beneath the falling snow outside the windows. And somewhere between untouched tea, hospital hallways, and a waitress nobody important had noticed at first, two people had changed each other without ever meaning to. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is not hiding weakness. Sometimes they are carrying enough strength for everyone else too.